Nobody opened room 13 for 30 years. Then a retired soldier and his German shepherd walked into that hotel, and everything left behind finally had a chance to speak. The old hotel stood quietly at the edge of a small Montana town, surrounded by tall pine trees and endless fields beneath a gray morning sky. For most people, it was just an abandoned building with broken memories trapped inside its walls. But for Ethan Brooks, it was something he never expected to receive. A second chance. After 26 years serving in the United States Army, Ethan had learned how to live with silence. He knew the sound of early mornings, empty rooms, and long roads with no destination. When he finally returned to civilian life, he discovered something he had not prepared for. The hardest part of leaving the military was not saying goodbye. It was finding out who he was afterward. The one constant beside him was Shadow, his German shepherd. The dog had been with Ethan through every difficult transition, every uncertain day, and every moment when words were not enough. Shadow never asked questions. He simply stayed. Then one afternoon, Ethan received a letter from an attorney he had never met. Inside was an unexpected message. A man named Walter Hayes had passed away and left Ethan ownership of an old hotel. Ethan had never heard of Walter. He had no connection to the man, no family ties, and no idea why someone would leave him a property worth years of history. The letter included only one explanation. He believed you were the person who needed it. Ethan almost dismissed it as a mistake, but something about the word stayed with him. A week later, he arrived at the hotel with Shadow walking beside him. The building was larger than he imagined. The wooden sign above the entrance was faded, but the name was still visible. Hayes Mountain Hotel. The front doors opened with a slow creak, revealing a lobby filled with old furniture, covered photographs, and the quiet scent of a place that had been untouched for years. Ethan walked carefully through the empty halls. Every room seemed frozen in another time. There were guest books on the front desk, old paintings on the walls, and handwritten notes tucked inside drawers. It did not feel abandoned. It felt like someone was waiting to return. Shadow moved slowly beside him, observing every corner. The German shepherd stopped near the staircase and looked upward. Ethan noticed, but continued exploring. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Shadow remained still for a moment before following him again. That evening, Ethan learned more about the hotel from the people in town. They remembered Walter Hayes as a quiet man who always helped others. They said the hotel was once more than a place to sleep. It was a place where people came when they needed a fresh beginning. But when Walter closed the doors, nobody knew why. There was one detail everyone mentioned. Room 13. The room at the end of the second-floor hallway. The room nobody entered. The room Walter always kept locked. Ethan smiled slightly when he heard the story. Old buildings always had rumors. But later that night, while walking through the hallway with Shadow, he noticed something strange. The dog stopped in front of room 13 and lowered his head. He was not afraid. He was listening. Ethan stood beside him in the quiet hallway, hearing only the sound of the old building settling around them. Then, from behind the locked door, came a faint sound. Not a voice, not a movement. Something softer, something waiting. Ethan looked at Shadow, and for the first time since arriving, he felt certain about one thing. This hotel had not brought him here by accident, and whatever was hidden behind room 13 was the reason he was meant to find it. The hallway outside room 13 remained silent long after Ethan Brooks and Shadow walked away that night. But the question stayed with him. What had Walter Hayes protected behind that locked door for all those years? The next morning, sunlight entered through the old windows of Hayes Mountain Hotel, revealing dust floating through the air like tiny pieces of forgotten time. Ethan made coffee in the empty kitchen and looked around the quiet building. For the first time in years, he did not feel like he was standing in a place that belonged to someone else. He felt like he was standing at the beginning of a story he was meant to understand. Shadow rested near the doorway, watching him with calm attention. The German shepherd seemed to know that something important was unfolding, even if Ethan still had more questions than answers. Before making any decisions about the hotel, Ethan wanted to learn about Walter Hayes. He drove into town and visited the local library, where old newspapers and records were stored. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret Collins, recognized the name immediately. Walter was different, she said softly. He never cared about being remembered. He cared about making sure others were not forgotten. Ethan listened carefully as Margaret explained the history of the hotel. Decades earlier, Hayes Mountain Hotel had welcomed travelers, workers, and people who simply needed a quiet place to begin again. Walter often offered help without expecting anything in return. He gave people opportunities when they had nowhere else to go. But after many years, he suddenly closed the hotel. No announcement. No explanation. The doors simply remained locked. Everyone wondered about room 13, Margaret continued. Walter always said some things should only be opened by the right person at the right time. Ethan looked down at the old photograph she placed on the table. It showed Walter standing in front of the hotel, smiling beside a group of guests. There was something familiar about the image. Not the faces, but the feeling behind it. It reminded Ethan of the bonds he had seen throughout his years of service. People from different backgrounds becoming connected because someone chose to care. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned to the hotel with a new perspective. Room 13 no longer felt like a mystery created by rumors. It felt like a message left by someone who believed the future mattered. He walked upstairs with Shadow beside him. The hallway seemed different in the daylight. The old wooden floor creaked beneath their steps, and the faded paintings on the walls looked like pieces of a forgotten family album. When they reached the door, Shadow stopped again. This time, Ethan paid closer attention. The German Shepherd gently moved near the bottom of the door and sniffed the space beneath it. Ethan noticed a small detail he had missed before. A thin line of fresh air moved through the gap. The room was sealed, but not completely. There was a hidden connection somewhere. Ethan examined the hallway carefully. Behind an old painting beside the door, he discovered a small metal plate attached to the wall. It was covered with years of dust. He cleaned it gently and found a message engraved into the surface. For those who seek answers, remember the people first. Ethan stood quietly, reading the words again. Walter was not protecting a treasure. He was protecting a lesson. That evening, Ethan searched through the hotel records stored in the office. Inside an old guest book, he found hundreds of names. Some had handwritten notes beside them. Some had small messages of gratitude. The pages told stories of people who had arrived at the hotel carrying uncertainty and left carrying hope. Near the final pages, Ethan found something unusual. A name written by Walter himself. Beside it was a note that simply said, "The last guest will understand." Ethan looked at Shadow. The German Shepherd tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for the next step. For years, Ethan had followed orders, completed missions, and protected others. But this was different. Nobody was telling him what to do. He had to choose. As the evening light faded over the mountains, Ethan returned to room 13. He placed his hand on the old door handle and took a quiet breath. Whatever waited inside was not just a secret from the past. It was a responsibility for the future. And for the first time, Ethan was ready to open the door. The old handle moved slightly beneath Ethan Brooks's hand, but the door of room 13 did not open immediately. For a moment, he stood there in the quiet hallway of Hayes Mountain Hotel, listening to the stillness around him. Shadow sat beside him, calm and patient, waiting for Ethan to decide the next step. The veteran understood something in that moment. The door was not just made of wood and metal. It carried years of memories, questions, and a story someone had trusted him to discover. Ethan turned the handle again, and this time the lock released with a soft click. The door opened slowly, revealing a room untouched by time. The air inside was different from the rest of the hotel. It smelled of old paper, cedar wood, and memories that had been carefully protected. There were no expensive objects. No hidden fortune. No treasure waiting to be claimed. Instead, the room was filled with shelves, photographs, handwritten letters, and small personal items arranged with incredible care. Ethan stepped inside, while Shadow followed quietly behind him. On the wall was a simple wooden sign that read, "Every person leaves a story behind." Ethan walked closer and picked up the first photograph. It showed Walter Hayes standing with a group of guests outside the hotel many years earlier. They were not famous people. They were ordinary people. But beside each photograph was a handwritten note explaining why that person mattered. Ethan began reading them one by one. There was a young man who arrived at the hotel unsure about his future and left with a new skill. There was a retired worker who found friendship after years of feeling alone. There was a former service member who stayed at the hotel during a difficult transition and discovered that life still had new chapters waiting. Ethan felt something familiar as he read those stories. He had seen the same quiet struggles among people he served with. Sometimes the hardest battles were not visible. Sometimes people simply needed someone to remind them they still had value. Shadow walked toward a small desk in the corner of the room and stopped. On the surface was an old guest book covered with a layer of dust. Ethan opened it carefully. The pages contained hundreds of names, dates, and messages. Each entry showed a small moment of kindness. A meal shared. A conversation remembered. A person who arrived as a stranger and left feeling seen. Near the final pages, Ethan noticed something unusual. There was a blank space with a note written by Walter. The next person must understand why this room exists. Ethan stared at the words for a long time. Walter had not created room 13 to hide secrets. He had created it to protect stories. He wanted someone to understand that every person who walked through the hotel doors carried something important, even if they did not recognize it themselves. As Ethan continued searching, he found a small envelope tucked beneath the guest book. His name was written on the front. The sight of it made him pause. Walter had passed away before Ethan ever knew the hotel existed. Yet somehow, this message had been waiting for him. Ethan opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single page written in Walter's handwriting. The first sentence was simple. If you are reading this, then you have already discovered the truth. Ethan continued reading as Shadow rested beside him. Walter explained that the hotel was never meant to be remembered for its rooms, its walls, or its history. It was meant to be remembered for the people who found hope there. He wrote that the person who inherited the hotel would have a choice. They could see it as an old building filled with memories, or they could see it as a place where new memories could begin. Ethan lowered the letter and looked around room 13. For years, he had searched for a new purpose after leaving the army. Now he was standing inside a room created by someone who believed purpose could be passed from one person to another. Shadow looked up at him, and Ethan placed a hand gently on the German shepherd's shoulder. The dog had not found a hidden treasure. He had found a doorway to a forgotten mission. But as Ethan read the final line of Walter's letter, he realized room 13 still held one more secret. Somewhere inside the hotel was the reason Walter chose this place to begin his work, and Ethan knew he had to uncover the story behind it. The final sentence in Walter Hayes's letter stayed with Ethan Brooks long after he finished reading it. The hotel was not built from bricks and wood alone. It was built from moments when someone chose to care. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. For the first time since inheriting Hayes Mountain Hotel, he stopped wondering why Walter had chosen him. Instead, he started asking a different question. What was he supposed to do next? The morning after discovering room 13, Ethan walked through the hotel with a different feeling. The empty hallways no longer felt abandoned. They felt like they were waiting for something. Shadow followed beside him, his paws moving quietly across the old wooden floors. The German shepherd had a way of making the silence feel less heavy. Ethan returned to Walter's office and began searching through the remaining records. He wanted to understand the beginning of the hotel story, not just the final chapter. Behind a row of old books, he found a small wooden box that had been hidden from view. Inside were several documents, each carefully organized by year. The oldest papers were dated more than 40 years earlier. Ethan opened the first folder and discovered something unexpected. Before Hayes Mountain Hotel became known as a place of kindness, it was almost something completely different. Walter had originally planned to create a luxury retreat. The designs showed beautiful rooms, elegant spaces, and a successful business plan. But as Ethan continued reading, he noticed the change. The plan slowly shifted. The focus moved away from profit and toward people. Walter wrote about meeting travelers who were exhausted, veterans searching for direction, and families trying to rebuild after difficult seasons of life. He realized that a hotel could be more than a place where people stayed for a night. It could be a place where people remembered they were not alone. Ethan sat quietly at the desk, thinking about those words. He understood that feeling better than most. After leaving the army, he had struggled with the transition back into ordinary life. People often thanked him for his service, but few understood what came after. The routines changed. The purpose changed. The identity he carried for years suddenly felt uncertain. Shadow moved closer and rested beside his chair. Ethan smiled softly. Somehow, this dog had followed him through every uncertain moment and brought him to a place where those questions finally had answers. Later that afternoon, Ethan visited the town again and spoke with Margaret Collins. He showed her some of the documents he found. She looked at them carefully and nodded. Walter always believed this place belonged to the people, she said. He never wanted it to be remembered as his hotel. He wanted it to be remembered as everyone's place. Ethan looked toward the mountains outside the window. He began to understand why Walter had left everything behind instead of simply selling the property. The hotel was not an inheritance. It was a responsibility. When Ethan returned that evening, he noticed something unusual near room 13. A small section of the hallway wall looked different from the others. The paint was slightly newer, and the wooden panel did not match the surrounding design. Shadow walked toward it and paused. Ethan carefully examined the area and discovered a small hidden compartment behind the panel. Inside was another envelope. This one was older than the others. On the front, Walter had written only 4 words. The beginning is here. Ethan opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph of Walter standing beside a younger man wearing a military uniform. On the back of the picture was a handwritten message. He reminded me why this place mattered. Ethan looked closer at the photograph, trying to understand who the man was and why Walter had kept this memory hidden for so many years. Shadow sat beside him, watching quietly. The veteran knew he had discovered another piece of the story. But this time, it was not only about Walter. It was about someone whose life had changed the entire purpose of Hayes Mountain Hotel. And Ethan was about to learn why. The photograph remained in Ethan Brooks's hand long after the evening sky turned dark outside Hayes Mountain Hotel. The image was old, the edges worn from years of being touched, but the moment captured inside it felt alive. Walter Hayes stood beside a young man wearing a military uniform, both of them smiling in front of the hotel entrance. Ethan looked at the face of the soldier and felt something familiar, not because he knew him, but because he recognized the quiet expression in his eyes. It was the look of someone carrying responsibility while searching for where they belonged. On the back of the photograph, Walter had written only one sentence. He reminded me why. This place mattered. Ethan placed the picture on the desk and began searching through Walter's records again. This time, he was not looking for secrets. He was looking for a person. Inside another folder, he found letters exchanged between Walter and the young soldier. The first letter was dated decades earlier. The soldier's name was Daniel Carter. He had arrived at Hayes Mountain Hotel after completing his military service and struggling to adjust to a different kind of life. Walter's letters revealed that Daniel was not looking for a vacation. He was looking for direction. The hotel became a quiet place where Daniel could rebuild his confidence and discover what came next. Ethan read every page slowly. The story felt strangely familiar. Like Daniel, Ethan had spent years knowing how to serve others, but struggling to understand his own future. The difference was that Daniel had found Walter at the right moment. Now Ethan was discovering the same kindness years later. Shadow rested near the desk, while Ethan continued reading. The German shepherd seemed peaceful, almost as if he understood that these pages carried something important. The letters showed that Walter did not simply give Daniel a place to stay. He gave him a reason to believe that his life still had value. Over time, Daniel helped Walter transform the hotel's purpose. Together, they created a place where people could find support during uncertain times. They welcomed veterans, travelers, and anyone who needed a reminder that they mattered. Ethan looked around the old office. Suddenly, the hotel felt less like an abandoned building and more like a living memory. Every room, every hallway, and every photograph represented a choice someone made to help another person. As he continued reading, Ethan discovered that Daniel eventually moved away to start a family and build a new life. But before leaving, he wrote one final letter to Walter. In it, Daniel thanked him for seeing something in him that he could not see himself. He wrote that sometimes people do not need someone to fix their lives. They simply need someone to believe they can create a better future. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Those words reached deeper than he expected. For years, he had carried the belief that purpose came from duty and responsibility. But now he was beginning to understand that purpose could also come from compassion. The next morning, Ethan returned to room 13. He wanted to know why Walter kept Daniel's story there. Inside the hidden compartment, he found another small box. This one contained a collection of handwritten notes from people who had stayed at the hotel. Each note expressed gratitude for something simple: a conversation, a meal, a moment when someone listened. At the bottom of the box was a final message from Walter. Never measure this place by what it owns. Measure it by what it gives. Ethan read the sentence quietly. He looked at Shadow, who was sitting beside him, and smiled. The German Shepherd had led him to the first discovery, but now Ethan understood the deeper meaning behind the journey. This hotel was never about locked doors or forgotten rooms. It was about the people who found hope inside them. But as Ethan placed the box back on the shelf, he noticed something hidden underneath it. A small key attached to a faded tag. There was no room number written on it. Only 2 words. The beginning. Ethan held the key carefully and looked toward the hallway beyond room 13. He knew Walter had left one more piece of the story waiting. And this time, the answer was not behind a door. It was somewhere beneath the foundation of everything Walter had built. The small key with the faded tag rested in Ethan Brooks's hand as he stood in the quiet hallway outside room 13. The words written on the tag were simple. The beginning. For most people, it would have looked like another forgotten object inside an old hotel. But Ethan had learned something about Walter Hayes. Nothing was placed here without a reason. Shadow stood beside him, watching the key with the same calm curiosity he had shown since arriving at Hayes Mountain Hotel. The German Shepherd had never rushed ahead. He simply noticed the moments that mattered. Ethan returned to Walter's office and searched through the old building records one more time. He looked for anything connected to the key, but there was no mention of it in the guest books or documents. Then Shadow walked toward the corner of the room and stopped beside a large wooden cabinet. Ethan moved closer and noticed something unusual. The cabinet was slightly away from the wall, leaving a narrow space behind it. Together, they moved it carefully and discovered a small metal door hidden behind the wood. The key in Ethan's hand fit perfectly. The door opened into a narrow passage that led beneath the hotel. The air was cool and carried the scent of old stone and cedar. Ethan turned on his flashlight and stepped forward slowly while Shadow walked beside him. The passage was not frightening. It felt like a place that had been waiting patiently for someone to arrive. After several feet, they reached a small underground room. Inside were shelves filled with boxes, journals, and photographs. But unlike room 13, this place was not filled with stories of guests. It was filled with the story of Walter himself. Ethan opened the first box and found letters written by Walter over many decades. They revealed a side of the man that few people in town had ever seen. Walter had once been lost too. Before creating the hotel's mission, he had experienced his own period of uncertainty. He had achieved success, but he felt disconnected from the world around him. According to his journals, everything changed after one unexpected encounter. Years earlier, Walter met a traveler who stayed at the hotel during a difficult season of life. That person shared a simple idea with him. A place becomes meaningful because of the people who feel welcome inside it. Those words changed Walter's entire view. He stopped seeing the hotel as a business and started seeing it as a place of connection. Ethan sat quietly while reading those pages. He thought about how similar their journeys were. Both men had reached a point where they needed to understand what came next. Both discovered that helping others could become a path forward. Shadow rested beside him as Ethan continued exploring the hidden room. On one shelf, he found a collection of small wooden boxes. Each box had a name written on it. Inside were personal items left behind by people who had stayed at the hotel. A photograph, a handwritten note, a small reminder of a moment that changed someone's life. Ethan realized Walter had protected these items because they represented something more valuable than money. They represented proof that kindness could continue long after a person was gone. Near the back of the room, Ethan discovered a large journal with a dark leather cover. The first page contained a message from Walter. The next caretaker must understand one thing. This place was never built to remember me. It was built to remind others that they matter. Ethan closed the journal and looked around the underground room. For years, he had believed his own story was already written. His military service had ended. His purpose had become uncertain. But standing there beneath the hotel, surrounded by Walter's memories, he felt something returning. A sense of direction. A reason to move forward. As he prepared to leave, Shadow suddenly walked toward the far wall and stopped. Behind an old shelf was another small compartment. Ethan opened it carefully and found a single envelope. This one was different. It was newer than everything else. On the front was a message written in Walter's handwriting. For the person who chooses to continue. Ethan held the envelope and felt the weight of those words. He knew the next discovery would not simply explain Walter's past. It would reveal what Walter hoped someone would do with his future. The envelope in Ethan Brooks's hand felt heavier than its size suggested. Standing inside the hidden room beneath Hayes Mountain Hotel, the veteran understood that Walter Hayes had not left behind random memories. Every photograph, every letter, and every locked space had been part of a carefully built message. Shadow watched quietly as Ethan opened the envelope marked with Walter's handwriting. Inside was a single letter and a small collection of documents. The first line immediately caught Ethan's attention. "If you found this, then you understand what this place was always meant to be." Ethan continued reading while the soft sound of the hotel above them filled the silence. Walter explained that he had spent years searching for someone who understood responsibility, not ownership. He did not want a person who would simply maintain the building. He wanted someone who would protect the reason it existed. The documents revealed the final chapter of Walter's connection with Hayes Mountain Hotel. Years before his passing, Walter created a private program for people who needed a place to rebuild their confidence. Some were veterans returning to civilian life. Some were individuals who had lost direction after major changes. Others were simply people who needed a reminder that they still had something valuable to offer. Ethan slowly turned the pages, recognizing the same feelings he had carried for years. After leaving the army, he had been grateful for his experiences, but he also struggled with the quiet moments afterward. He knew how to follow a mission. He knew how to protect others, but he was still learning how to create a new purpose. Walter's words felt like they were written for him. The old hotel was not asking Ethan to preserve the past. It was asking him to continue a tradition of helping people find their way forward. Shadow moved closer and rested beside Ethan's feet. The German Shepherd had been there through every discovery, every question, and every moment of reflection. Ethan smiled as he realized that the dog had brought him somewhere deeper than a hidden room. Shadow had brought him back to a sense of connection. After returning upstairs, Ethan spent the next few days exploring the hotel with new eyes. He no longer looked at the empty rooms as forgotten spaces. He saw possibilities. The dining area could become a place where people gathered again. The old office could become a place where stories were recorded. The guest rooms could once again offer comfort to those searching for a fresh beginning. But before making any plans, Ethan wanted to understand one final part of Walter's story. He visited Margaret Collins again and showed her the documents he discovered. When she saw the old records, she became quiet for a moment. "Walter always believed someone would come," she said. "He never knew who that person would be. He only hoped they would understand." Ethan looked at the photograph of Walter and Daniel Carter. He finally understood why that image had been hidden away. Daniel was not just one person Walter helped. He represented everyone who had walked into the hotel carrying uncertainty and left with hope. That evening, Ethan returned to room 13 with Shadow beside him. He placed the documents carefully on the desk and looked around the room that had started this journey. The locked door was no longer a mystery. It was an invitation. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Ethan heard a quiet sound from the hallway. Someone had entered the hotel lobby. He walked downstairs and found an older man standing near the entrance, looking around with emotion in his eyes. The man introduced himself as someone who had stayed at Hayes Mountain Hotel many years ago. He said he heard the doors might open again. Ethan listened as the stranger shared a story about Walter and the kindness he had received there. For the first time in decades, the hotel was hearing a new voice. Ethan looked at Shadow and smiled. The German Shepherd had helped uncover the hidden truth behind room 13. But now Ethan understood the real discovery. The hotel was never waiting for someone to unlock its secrets. It was waiting for someone to open its doors again. The old hotel had been quiet for many years, but now every morning brought a new sound. The sound of footsteps in the hallway. The sound of conversations in the lobby. The sound of people remembering something they thought they had lost forever. Ethan Brooks stood near the front entrance of Hayes Mountain Hotel, watching sunlight move across the wooden floors. A few weeks earlier, this place had felt like a forgotten building filled with unanswered questions. Now it felt like something that was beginning again. Shadow rested beside him, calmly observing the visitors who had returned after hearing that the hotel doors were opening once more. The German Shepherd had always been part of the journey, but Ethan knew the dog represented something even greater. Shadow reminded him that loyalty was not always about protecting someone from danger. Sometimes it was about staying beside someone while they found their way. Over the following days, Ethan worked with people from the town to carefully restore the hotel. He did not want to erase its history. He wanted to protect it. The old photographs remained on the walls. Walter's notes stayed in room 13. The guest books were placed where visitors could read the stories of those who had passed through before them. Every corner of the hotel carried a memory. One afternoon, Margaret Collins brought Ethan a small box she had kept for years. Inside were several letters from former guests who had stayed at the hotel during difficult moments in their lives. Ethan read them slowly. Each letter described something simple. A conversation with Walter. A meal shared with strangers. A moment when someone felt understood. None of the stories were about luxury or comfort. They were about kindness. Ethan realized that was the true value of Hayes Mountain Hotel. It was never measured by the number of rooms or the size of the property. It was measured by the people who left feeling stronger than when they arrived. As the hotel became active again, more former guests returned. Some came to share memories. Some came simply to walk through the old halls one more time. They told Ethan stories about Walter that he had never found in any document. They described a man who always noticed when someone needed encouragement. A man who believed a small act of kindness could change the direction of a person's life. Ethan listened carefully because he understood something important. Walter's greatest achievement was not creating a successful hotel. It was creating a place where people felt they belonged. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch with Shadow while the mountains turned gold beneath the setting sun. He thought about the strange path that brought him there. A letter from a stranger. An inherited hotel. A locked room. A hidden passage. Every discovery had led him closer to understanding what Walter wanted him to see. Ethan looked at Shadow and smiled. The German shepherd had found the first clue, but the real discovery had been much deeper. He had found a reason to serve again. The next morning, Ethan opened room 13 and placed a new item inside. It was not a document or an old photograph. It was a simple notebook. On the first page, he wrote a message for future visitors. Every person who enters this room carries a story. Take time to listen. It was the same lesson Walter had left behind. The lesson that people matter more than possessions. That memories are more valuable than objects. That a place becomes special because of the hearts connected to it. Months passed, and Hayes Mountain Hotel became known once again. Not as a forgotten building. Not as a mystery. But as a place where people could begin again. Ethan continued caring for the hotel, and Shadow remained beside him every day. Visitors often smiled when they saw the German shepherd walking through the halls, because they understood that he was more than a dog. He was part of the story that brought everyone together. One quiet evening, Ethan returned to room 13 and looked at the old photographs on the wall. He thought about Walter, Daniel, and every person whose life had crossed paths with this place. He finally understood the message that had been waiting for him from the beginning. Some doors are not locked because something valuable is hidden behind them. Some doors are locked because the right person has not arrived yet. And when that person finally comes, the door does not reveal a secret. It reveals a purpose. The seasons changed at Hayes Mountain Hotel, but the feeling inside the old building remained the same. What was once a place filled with silence had become a place filled with stories. Every morning, Ethan Brooks opened the front doors and watched people walk inside with curiosity and leave with something they did not expect. They did not leave with expensive souvenirs or forgotten treasures. They left with memories. And Ethan finally understood that this was the legacy Walter Hayes had protected all those years. One quiet afternoon, Ethan sat in the hotel office reviewing the old guest books. The pages were filled with names from decades past, each one connected to a moment that mattered. Beside him, Shadow rested peacefully on the floor. The German shepherd had grown older with the journey, but his loyalty had never changed. Ethan looked down at his companion and smiled, remembering the first day they arrived. At that time, he thought he had inherited an abandoned hotel. He thought he had been given a building full of unanswered questions. But now he knew he had been given something much greater. He had been given a chance to continue a story that started long before him. The town had changed because of the hotel's return. People who once passed by without stopping began visiting again. Local families shared meals in the dining room. Veterans came to talk, laugh, and remember that their service was only one chapter of their lives, not the entire story. Young visitors walked through the halls and learned about the people who had shaped the hotel's history. Ethan made sure every person who arrived understood the lesson Walter left behind. A person's value is never measured by what they own. It is measured by what they give. Months later, Ethan discovered one final note hidden inside the back cover of Walter's original journal. He had read the journal many times before, but somehow, he had never noticed the small piece of paper attached inside. The handwriting was familiar. Walter's final words were simple. To the person who continues this place, remember this. The greatest rooms are not built with walls. They are built with the moments people share inside them. Ethan sat quietly for a long time after reading those words. He thought about everything that had happened. The locked door, room 13, the hidden passage, the photographs, the letters. Every discovery had led him to the same truth. The hotel was never hiding something from him. It was teaching him something. That evening, Ethan walked through the hotel one last time before closing the office for the night. He stopped at room 13 and looked at the photographs covering the wall. Daniel Carter, Walter Hayes, the many guests who had found hope inside these halls. Their stories were no longer forgotten. They had become part of something that would continue. Shadow walked beside him and gently rested near the doorway. Ethan placed his hand on the German shepherd's shoulder and whispered, "You knew." "Before I did, didn't you?" The dog looked up quietly, and Ethan laughed softly. Some answers did not need words. Years earlier, Ethan believed his most meaningful days were behind him. He believed service belonged to the past. But Walter had shown him that service was not a uniform or a location. It was a choice to care, a choice to listen, a choice to help someone else find their way. The hotel remained standing beneath the mountains, no longer forgotten and no longer waiting. It had become exactly what Walter hoped it would become, a place where people remembered they mattered. And beside Ethan was the companion who helped him find the first door, the first clue, and the first step toward a new beginning. Shadow never discovered a secret because he was looking for one. He discovered it because he was always paying attention. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with a quiet moment, a loyal friend, and a door waiting for the right person to open it.